I could turn back time, if I could find a way, I'd take back those words that hurt you, and you'd stay. I don't know why I did the things I did. I don't know why I said the things I said. Pride's like a knife, it can cut deep inside. Words are like weapons, they wound sometimes. I didn't really mean to hurt you. I didn't want to see you go. I know I made you cry, but baby, if I could turn back time, if I could find a way.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. As you're coming in, I'd love to see. Today, we're going to be talking about failure and how to turn failure into fuel. So what I'd love to do is just have you start putting how you define failure in the chat. I'd love to start seeing some comments about that. Yes, Carolyn, sweet tunes. I know. I searched songs about failure, and shares, if you could turn back time, was the first to come up. So I figured, of course, that has to be Cher. With 4 decades of best-selling albums, you can't go too wrong with Cher. Yeah, so I would love to start seeing people contributing. How do you define failure in the chat? Failure equal expectation minus outcome. Love that. Opportunity to learn. Not meeting our own or someone else's expectation. Missing the mark. Yeah, what a great, simple way to look at it. Failure is data. Love that, Carolyn. Wonderful. Not preparing and making an attempt. It's great. Yeah, first attempts are often failures for learning and waiting. +1 to failure is data. Yeah, curriculum. Absolutely. Cool. So I'm going to slide Cher into the background. You got to love her, but hopefully everyone came here to hear me today instead of Cher. So I'm going to share my screen a little bit, pun intended, of course. So today I'm going to be talking about failure. Hopefully everyone can see my screen there a little bit, or just fine. And as some of you know, I'm CEO of Aristotle Performance. And today I'm going to be revealing how you can fundamentally change your relationship with failure. As we see it now, failure is absolute. It's sort of like decision making. Often, you can see in some of the comments below as well, whereas there are some people commenting like failure is a part of the process and it's a lack, but it's a lack of success. It's it's this absolute thing often. And, as Aristotle Performance, we are a boutique leadership and organizational development firm based in North America. And we work internationally as experts in performance, adaptability, and psychological safety. But today, we're going to be talking about failure as fuel. So why am I talking about failure? And, when Jason said, we want you to put some presentation together, I'd love for you to be a speaker. What do you want to talk about? Failure was top of my list. And in part, it's because the realities of failure and learning have been at the forefront of my life for effectively my entire life. Learning from failure actually started when I was very young. And I didn't really realize this until I started teaching my daughter how to play piano. And as my daughter was learning to play piano, I was realizing that this was my first and most amazing forum for developing the ability to see mistakes and error or failure as a teacher rather than a complete or final outcome. But this was only a first look. I achieved university level piano at the age of 12 years old. and was regularly competing with and being invited to play alongside people who were 20 to 30 years older than me, many of them already playing with orchestras in the Pacific Northwest where I live. And as I got older, this trend would really continue. My capacity to learn was taken, really took me further than my age ever gave me any right to. I worked as a young man alongside ironworkers. At 16, one of my first days on the job, I watched a man cut his hand in half between his middle finger and his ring finger all the way to his wrist. So I had learned that piano was this beautiful place to see error as instruction. But then I got to the world outside of that safe little bubble and started to see that failure could have real consequence. And that if you didn't take the early warning signs, that failure could lead to significant and life-changing changes. So this also led to this kind of mindset of like, if you're not going to die at work, can you respond with more thoughtfulness? You know, at the age of 19, I had the opportunity to operate a sports store. It had been categorized as a failure. So handing it to me was effectively seen as a low risk endeavor. My manager trusted me and believed in me and acted as a thought partner, keeping guardrails up just high enough that I wouldn't fail too dramatically, but I could learn rapidly and I was free to experiment. So I got to see what it felt like and experience what it looked like to be in an environment where failure was seen as instruction in a more leadership capacity as well. But my preference for high risk sports, mountain biking, skiing, working as a ski race coach and an instructor, pushing my limits really everywhere I could. And for those of you who know me, there's a lot of that experience in my life, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But often in environments where risk may be low, like rock climbing, but the consequences are very, very high, or where the risk might be high, but the consequences sort of moderate into something like mountain biking. Through this, I developed a mindset already of what's the worst that could happen. Jason Eisner, the producer of the event here today, and myself were recently in Manchester, England, presenting to a group and kicking off a larger program. And I sort of said at an offhand comment to someone when they were asking about how to implement something. I said, well, what's the worst that's going to happen? Nobody's going to die. And what was interesting was how firmly the CEO actually grabbed onto that and said, this is the attitude that I want more and more of you to take. I want you to really consider what's the worst that could actually happen, because nothing that bad is actually happening when we're challenging each other, when we're pushing our boundaries. But this mindset really carried over into my life as an arborist and tree faller. If it wasn't going to kill you, it was fine. Just give it a shot. And in fact, when we trained young climbers, this is what we would often say. You know, you're scared, but is it going to kill you? And like that was a pretty low barrier, pretty low boundary. But this was a game that was always played. We were experimenting with the edges of what was possible, and we shared, always talking, always learning, always sharing. It was really a masterclass of rapid sharing of information and new knowledge with each other. I really mastered working with all different kinds of modalities, working with old timers and getting all their feedback from how things used to be, working with new school kids right out of university. What are they teaching now? And really become this collector of wisdom. So the key was really for me to build a library of solutions. And this is when I started working in the live music and events industry as a high rigor stage manager technician. And the skill of learning was well in hand, and the skill of leadership was becoming sharpened. I'd held a leadership position since I was 13 years old. So I'm almost at 30 years of having some leadership position for almost every month of every year of my life since that time. And I've led over 200 teams. So this categorizing failure as a way to capture new knowledge was really embedded. And then applying that to leadership and having several dozens and then eventually a couple hundred plus teams to lead gave me lots of opportunities to fail fast, and learn well. And after all, like this attitude of what's the worst that could happen? And some of this leads to in my upcoming book, and I'm going to put something in the chat here for everyone. If you want to go to this link, you can actually, as part of your, I'll put it in there later, as part of your ticket to Psych Safety Day, you can have a free copy of my book. So I'll put a link up to that later. But what I share is this confidence equation. It's really simple. Doing something to completion multiplied by the amount you acknowledge that it was done to completion over time. That's it. If you do things to completion and acknowledge it, you soon realize that you can do more things to completion. And the problem is that most people don't acknowledge that they have actually done something, or they give themselves credit where it isn't really deserved. But I didn't have anything to lose when I started moving into the corporate world and starting out as a coach and then working in leadership development, working with teams, working with organizations. And I had a belief that it would be okay. I had a fallback plan, and my fallback plan was I'll figure it out. But what's the worst that could happen? And that's when my journey really took off. And that's what brings me here today. I learned along the way how obsessed the corporate world was with failure. Too big to fail. Failure is not an option. Fail fast, go fast, break things, fail forward. The science of failing well. I was surrounded at that time by people who were older, they were wiser, they had more connections, they had more experience with important sounding degrees, which I'll admit were intimidating as hell. But they were from important sounding schools, and more often than not, they had learned from the best. And when I only felt like I came in with, my ability to figure it out, I really came in with a degree from the School of Hard Knocks, with an undergrad, I like to say, in resilience. But the core skill was the ability to learn. I had turned failure into fuel. And in fact, Jason Eisner, as I said, the organizer of this event and my business partner for the last 5-6 years, was the first person to really point this out. My capacity to hear something and then immediately apply it. Often in one conversation, I would hear something, take it in, and then the next conversation, apply it. And as we built Aerosol Performance together, he watched, and as I would hear something and apply it in the next thing, quickly and smoothly adapting and applying new thinking, he was the person that actually pointed out that my real superpower was the capacity to learn. And my own resume, which of course now includes author, it is one more of a mosaic than a linear path. And I think a lot of people feel that way. And sometimes it's by accident, sometimes it's by intent, but learning is at the center of that. So, Joshua, I appreciate you throwing this in the chat. Noting completion is scary sometimes, leaves you open to others' judgment. Absolutely. And let me tell you, writing a book has been the most vulnerable and challenging version of that I've ever done, because now I know that the vulnerable stories and the ideas that I've put out there will be out there forever, and I'll never be able to take it back. So that's particularly poignant at this time. So I'm very worried about failure. But what I want to do is just stop for a second and just ask everyone to write in the chat, what is failure in your context? Failure is very contextual. One of the reasons why I shared some of my journey is because at different points, leading in Army cadets, playing piano or learning piano, being a dad, trying to teach my daughter something that I'm passionate about. Also working as an ironworker, an arborist, managing a sports store, working the live events of business, starting a journey into the corporate world. There's all different kinds of contexts. The failure is very different. So I'd love to see everyone put in the chat, what is failure in your context? Give everyone a couple of seconds. Taking risks that unintentionally harm others in some way. That is failure. Yeah, I've done a lot of work with firefighters, for example. My dad was a firefighter. He used to talk about what happened at work around the dinner table. The dinner table was his um, lie down on the couch moment, shall we say. Um, so got to hear a lot about this. Failure for me isn't necessarily achieving a goal or an object. It's failing to track how I arrived at success. I love that. That's a brilliant way to frame that. Missing the mark you were aiming for a while, keeping at the forefront of the contextual factors both in and out of your control. Love that, Brandon. Wonderful take on that. Yeah, failure is not trying. Failure in my context is failure to be present. Yeah, so there's all kinds of different ways that we can fail. But what I've learned is that there are some common features amongst those who navigate failure best. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because failure ultimately, at its core, simply means something didn't happen or work out the way we expected, right? You know, there's a couple of ways that we're common, but this is really at the foundation of what failure is. That boundary between whether failure was what we expected or not, or sorry, something happened and the way we expected or not. But at its core, or it's simply the distance between what should have happened or could have happened in our mind and what we envisioned, what happened in reality. And this is where the problem is. The science of failing well is a critical part of turning learning into outcomes, learning into action. But science is a process of exploration, discovery, application. I live in the Pacific Northwest where exploration really only happened 150 years ago. There was where my grandparents' home is, for example. There was nothing there. So this is a region of exploration. And exploration, discovery, and application require courage, compassion, curiosity. There's a boldness, there's character that comes before we engage in a scientific process of exploration. But it also requires something else. And this is why I like to say we don't really have a failure problem. The real problem is that we have a capacity to learn problem. Failure only becomes fuel when we have an engine big enough to turn it into real horsepower. I like to think of capacity not as an ability, but more like grit or toughness. The ability to make hard decisions and say yes when we know that yes is going to be uncomfortable. Or empathy, the ability to feel and respond to others' emotions. These are, for a lot of people, natural abilities and learning capabilities, or I should say, learnable capabilities. And they are something leadership should be continually investing in, learning, and demonstrating. The character traits that form the foundation for a capacity to learn are curiosity, courage, and compassion. They are the character traits at the core of this challenge, not failure. Failure points are easy to find. And this is how I like to flip my head flip this equation. Failure is easy to find. Learning is hard to do. And it's our capacity to learn that we need to work on, not finding the right failures to learn from. Once we have the capacity to both endure and respond to what didn't go the way we expected, we fundamentally change the equation. When you increase your capacity, failure becomes fuel instead of just another fire. So before I continue, I'd love to ask, how might you increase your capacity for learning? When I say capacity, what does it mean? And how do you think you might increase that capacity for learning? Please pop that in the chat. Give it a couple seconds. I'll take a sip of my coffee and let everyone do that. Because the real challenge here is that we get stuck. What was the question? The question was, how might you increase your capacity for learning? Here, I'll pop it in the chat myself. My cursor will work here, just not working. Supervision and intervision with other consultants. Yeah, absolutely. A wonderful idea. Taking the time to debrief projects, certainly. Ask meaningful questions and stay curious and interested in others. I love that. Interested in others, not just interested in what they have to say, but interested in them as human beings. What led them to say and think what they did. Approaching with curiosity, being courageous, and try not to be afraid of the opinions of others. I love that. I often find as a researcher that increasing your capacity for learning is being open to the possibility of being wrong. Well, you're going to like what comes up next. But before we get there, where do we get stuck? In my work and from our work with clients, we hear the kind of language we might expect all the time. And I mean, Jason and I often kind of giggle about a lot of these comments, but we want more innovation. It often sounds more like free labor. Give us your best ideas, your best thinking. We're not going to pay you any more for them, but give us your best ideas so we can profit from. This is the code language that we often hear instead of, learning is part of growth and interesting and compelling. Or we hear large organizations say things like, we need to start acting like a startup again, which is often code for, we want everyone to jump in with everything they got, work themselves to death, and hopefully that won't overwhelm you. And if it does, we'll just replace you. These kinds of things, this is how learning is often framed inside of organizations, and people accidentally send these signals that actually make it kind of risky and crummy and not really that valuable. But also on your team, teams, organizations, that's the way we've always done things, is where new ideas go to die. This is often because the system itself doesn't have the capacity to change built into it. Can't tolerate change, maybe because it's seen too much unnecessary change, or exhaustion is seen as a virtue, or because people are too afraid of what they might lose, or the annual performance review has led people to think that feedback happens once a year, and the following year is entirely dependent on that singular moment in time. Chances are your team doesn't have a shared story about what failure is. Chances are you've only ever talked about failure as an outcome instead of a failure as the result of smaller, more controllable, perhaps predictable failures. But when it comes to capacity, there's really two factors that matter more than anything. And it's the capacity to be wrong without shaming yourself. And the other is your tolerance for difference. So these are two muscles that really need to be built if we want to turn life, the world around us, the small, subtle failures into fuel for learning instead of wasted opportunities. Each of these requires curiosity, courage, and compassion, a lot of self-compassion in some cases, all of which allow you to endure discomfort in the pursuit of growth. And you'll notice that I'm focusing largely on the individual here, the leader, you, honestly, as the leader. The reason why is because you need to go first and further than you can ever ask your team. In facilitation, there's a saying, and lots of other domains too, of course, but the intervention will be determined, or the quality of the intervention will be determined by the inner state of the intervener. And as leaders, we are ultimately, to some degree, interveners in the lives of others. How you respond to others in the process of learning. Noelle, this is feeling like therapy. Well, therapy isn't a fix for everything, but there is a foundation to that to some degree. But ultimately, how you respond to others in the process of learning will depend on your capacity. Your capacity to learn will build or break others and your team's ability to respond to small failures too. The reason your team isn't innovating is because you're too attached to being right. The reason your company can't adapt is because your teams can't tolerate difference or be wrong without some degree of consequence, which includes the fear of being passed over or stagnation in the career. The change that you want starts with your own relationship with failure and increasing your capacity to learn. Then it radiates out. So that's why I'm focusing on this today. If anyone has any questions later, I'm always happy to take those and talk about how this more tangibly connects to the team. But the impact of increasing your capacity to be wrong without shaming yourself, frankly, is a feeling of freedom. And this is the best way I can describe it. Suddenly being wrong isn't a set of shackles. You can become free from the shackles of your previous, sometimes ill-informed mind. You don't need to live with ideas, decisions, or erroneous beliefs you made when you were a kid, for example. For people around you, it can completely change the experience of your leadership. Your capacity for inquiry-based leadership, which increases the longer you've been a leader and the higher up you go as a leader, the more senior you are, there's an increase for the need for inquiry-based leadership. And when you can be wrong and not shame yourself in the process, you can engage more and more in that. So it only goes up because new knowledge doesn't come with as much baggage. You aren't so worried about protecting your ego as you are improving the quality of your thinking. The impact of increasing your tolerance for difference is to increase your ability to navigate complexity by gathering more candid perspectives. Brene Brown said, trying to fit in is the opposite of belonging. Long before you welcome difference, you can't change a culture of belonging if you're unable to tolerate difference, for example. But I'll say this, growth is an endurance sport. And I've competed in triathlons, I've competed in ski mountaineering races. Short rests are very good. There's actually some research out there now that shows that marathoners who walk every 3 hours for about 10 minutes do better than those who run all the way through. So short rests are good. Being kind to yourself in the process is helpful, but constant adaptation is mandatory. And Jermaine, you said something here in the chat. I can't recall who said it, but one of the most illuminating things a professor ever told me was that winning an argument with someone isn't about being right. It's about being wrong and allowing yourself to learn and grow. You actually walk away with more value. Yeah, and I really love that statement and that mindset because it turns the mind and the person away from the idea of right and wrong and towards the idea of improved thinking. So how can you accomplish these two goals? This isn't this isn't a linear journey. So how can you be building these muscles, building this capacity as you rethink, relearn, evolve, and adapt? And I like to put these into sort of three main buckets. You need to start by being able to reframe your reactions, managing the fear response, reframing discomfort. Then you also need to be able to change your mental model, microdosing on being wrong, replacing judgment with inquiry, and redefine how you define yourself. Separate being wrong from being unworthy. Shift your mindset from proving to updating. So I'm going to go into these a little bit further. So let's talk about reframing your reactions. And I remember a manager saying this to me once, you really need to just take a breath and count to 10. And at the time, young, full of adrenaline and ego and all that kind of good stuff, I didn't really find it that helpful. And it's because my frame of reference for what I needed to be doing was all off. A frame is the constructed or borrowed set of beliefs we have about a situation. Those of you with imposter syndrome, for example, firstly, I want to thank you for having one. You might cringe to hear me say that, but I'm inviting you to reframe perhaps that it's a good thing. It's a pro-social behavior that keeps us from trying things that could get us or others hurt. It also shows we care, that we want to do and present our best work. Of course, it has a point where there is no longer helpful, but if we categorize all imposter syndrome as bad, we never learn that we actually transition from helpful to we never learn when we transition from helpful to harmful. And we forget to thank ourselves for learning how to navigate what can be a pretty hard world. So let's talk a little bit about how we respond to failure, or perhaps first, our tolerance or our worldview being challenged. We need to shift both our physiology and our cognitive responses in these moments. So I'll take a pretty common example, and then I want everyone to share how it can make you feel when I say this in the chat. So if you're leading, I think this might be wrong, or I don't agree, comes from your team. What is the first feeling that hits when someone says this to you in a meeting? These are simple declarative statements that can sometimes set us on our heels. So I'm curious how all of you feel. Yeah, so I have to defend myself now. Heat. I love that. Heat. Okay, tell me more. So there's some curiosity, but I love, Evelyn, what you said. It depends on the way it's said. And these declarative sentences, these statements, depending on our context, depending on the situation, our heart rate can spike. Cortisol and adrenaline can start coursing through our veins. For me, if I'm really being challenged and I wasn't ready for it, or I felt it was unwarranted or something like that, I used to actually feel it in my forearms. I could feel this strange sort of pulsing anomaly prepping me for action. It comes from a lifetime, well, not a lifetime anymore, but a long period of time constantly being ready to charge in and get things done. So even a small interruption can have an effect on this, like this can have this effect on the body. The brain automatically can treat this like a physical attack, especially if somebody's interrupted us. So first, we need to normalize this response. Sometimes it can catch us off guard. You can do something as simple as the breathwork reset from a guy named Andrew Huberman. It's a long, deep inhale. And then at the top of the breath, you take 2 more inhales. And this helps reset the brain. It's called the psychological sigh. So this can actually help us respond to that physiology. But what I like to do is point out that this exists at all. This is a significant challenge. And when we get triggered in those moments, we want to buy ourselves some time. You don't want to be like me, who was trying to count to 10 and just irritated by that. So this allows you to start shifting your relationship with discomfort. Firstly, start with appreciation. So when we're shifting our relationship with discomfort, this is the first thing to do, because you can do this externally as well, and it further buys you time. This is something I say to leaders often. Appreciation is an unbelievably powerful strategic tool. Not only can you find out where people are struggling by asking what they want to be appreciated for, but you can give people guidance through appreciation. And that's not a cheap thank you. Another way is to appreciate people for their contributions in a way to buy yourself time to formulate better questions. Buys you time, and it's key in this moment. But you need to realize that it is your body sharpening your mind so that you can navigate something novel or challenging. The reframe is that you're now better prepared, better able to, and have a greater capacity to learn if you choose to turn that power that your body has to ready you for growth instead of defense. It's that really what it comes down to is that discomfort happens, but when you turn on your curiosity instead, vulnerability and learning and growth become your armor instead of fear. And that the heart, this is building that capacity for learning, but learning is inherently vulnerable. So you have to be readying yourself for it. So we want to make learning, adaptability, and growth your armor instead of thinking that what you already know will keep you safe. So I've done a bunch of talking. I've shown a couple slides. And my favorite quote, which I should have gone to this slide a little second ago, but I'll leave this up here. So what I want everyone to do is write something in the chat that they're taking away from all of what I've said. Something that made you see an old problem in a new way, something that you are going to try differently. And as you're coming in, I want you to take a page from your colleagues, the other attendees, and look at what is inspiring new thinking. So Jarek, hopefully I'm saying your name properly. You've kind of already jumped the gun here, which is great, but reframing is like putting on glasses with different colored lenses. It allows you to look at failure in a different way. So I love that. But yeah, looking forward to seeing what everyone is taking away from what I'm sharing. And as you're doing that, yeah, let learning, adaptability, and growth be your armor rather than believing that what you know will keep you safe. Absolutely. If you increase your capacity to learn, old becomes uninteresting unless it's gained enough evidence to become a theory. That's one of the best ways to feel like your capacity is increasing when you no longer have that physiological response, right? If I go into the conversation with the idea of learning something new, even if I'm trying to persuade someone, I'm more likely to get something out of the conversation. Absolutely, yeah. Engaging that curiosity before you even start with somebody is an amazing way to preempt yourself. Yeah, you can't truly learn without having the experience of pain of failure. Yeah, and I think that's where the pain of failure is. And I was talking about this with my wife the other day as I was working through some of the details of this keynote, and I said, really, when your capacity for learning increases, the number one thing that happens is you stop seeing big failures in your life and you start seeing small moments as information because you can adapt and change to new information rapidly. You just see it everywhere all the time, and it becomes part of the fabric of your life as opposed to these big catastrophic moments where you feel regret, fear, all these things that are associated with larger failures. They just seem to happen less often. So to do this, we need to change our mental model to continue this journey towards increasing our tolerance for difference and improving our ability to be wrong without shaming ourselves. We need to change our mental model. With microdosing has become really popular. It's become kind of the new cool thing to do for top executives in Silicon Valley, and top performers are experimenting with all kinds of methods of microdosing to achieve the next gear or lasting peace, for example. But so why wouldn't I throw something in here like that? So microdosing is different than something like a 5% solution. So some people call this a 5% solution, or the smallest thing you can say or do, or this is my 10% solution, or whatever, or the Kaizen method, just a little bit better all the time. Whatever you want to call it. I don't like to think of it that way. I don't like to think of micro exposures or microdosing as that. But what I'm talking about microdosing on is admitting and acknowledging the small wrongs around us, the things that aren't going right, the things that are unknown, the things that are uncertain, creating space for little moments of doubt to come into our world. So whatever you call it, building capacity isn't like taking one step and then the next step and then the next step and then the next step. It's constantly bringing things into your awareness and trying to learn from them, because there's always holes in the bucket. There's going to be old information going out, so you need to be bringing new information in. And things like this are going to test and undermine your resolve. So if you microdose regularly, you're always going to be filling that bucket of knowledge and learning back up just a little bit each time. So what I like to recommend people do is admit small certainties, especially as a leader. It's actually very powerful to admit small uncertainties. So the timeline looks good, but there are a few things that could make it shift. I might be missing something here. Or my favorite that I've used this for years. This has been my way of like triggering this curiosity, this microdosing of small openings to new wisdom is I'm saying this, but I also maintain the right to be wrong. For me, it's been permission for me to be wrong, inviting others to challenge me and leaving the door open just a little with intention to have new information change my mind. And this has really been a cue to myself and others for years, and I have used this for a very, very long time, that nothing is so certain. I have the ability to sound completely sure when I'm completely unsure. So I have to make sure that I also sound like there's space for doubt. Learning is inherently vulnerable. So to increase your capacity, you need to make growth your armor. I've said this before, and I'll probably say it again. Growth is the way, but certainty is guaranteed to be not available. So doubt is uncomfortable. And I love this Voltaire quote. Doubt is uncomfortable, but certainty is ridiculous. So creating opportunity for small bits of realignment or new information to come in to be wrong increases your capacity to be wrong without shaming yourself. The next is, excuse me. The next one I like to talk about is replacing judgment with inquiry. So this is a critical to practice to build within yourself the awareness and skills that you can take to your team. The practice of inquiry and the play in the place of judgment is a critical one. My wife came to me recently. We talk about leadership stuff all the time. Of course, I think she kind of gets sucked into it. She came to me recently, and a meeting had been set aside for the frontline leaders in her organization to build their leadership skills and co-create the culture of her workplace. It was really put in their hands. We want to take this out of people and culture, and we want to put this in the hands of the leaders. And a meeting was set aside for them to do this. But it had progressively lowering attendance, progressively more focus on tasks rather than the future. It was becoming focused. It had become focused, for a lack of a better analogy, on governance rather than strategic or generative future. To be clear, this was not a place of learning. This meeting was not optional. The expectation was that they show up. So they had to, and they started getting good at like finding other reasons to not be there that the boss would be okay with. But the boss wants it. Like a players only meeting in a sports team where coaches step out and say, work together to make this better. I'm not going to be here. You as a team need to commit to each other rather than committing to me. So she wanted to orient the team towards a meeting that she was leading towards evaluation. And I simply said, you already have that data, but there isn't anyone asking what it could be. What would it be like to invite them to consider a different future state rather than further evaluating what they know isn't working? Through some conversation, we ended up with 4 key questions. That's what emerged, which of course would inspire some evaluation, but evaluation that would lead to more constructive conversation about the future. And that's really what was at the heart of this. Everybody knew it sucked. Nobody wanted to be there. Very few people could see the opportunity in it. So judgment was no longer going to get them where they wanted to go, which was having their time valued. Inquiry is what would take them to something new. At the team level, there was consideration of what could be. The focus had shifted from judgment to inquiry. And this is something you need to be able to do within yourself first. If you're going to be guiding a team in this way, doing it for yourself first is the greatest way to have some practice. You need to be able to hear someone say, I think this is wrong. But you need to start with, maybe I'm wrong. You need to be able to tolerate difference and reframe your reactions and embrace discomfort in the moment and be willing to welcome change instead. So questions as simple as what might be missing or is there another way to see this are great. And, for those of you who use some AI, if you're facing a challenge at work, this is another little microdose that you can give yourself. Open ChatGPT, write the context, write your current worldview, request it to not simply support your idea, but be willing to challenge it and say, what am I missing? Does this make sense? not only you are practicing shifting from judgment and inquiry, you are microdosing on new thinking, building new pathways and new levels of capacity. So again, I want to give everyone a moment to just write down what it is that you're learning from what I'm saying. What are you hearing me say, and what are you taking out of it? So yeah, we're going to do this again. Write something in the chat that you're taking away from all of what I just said, something that made you see an old problem in a new way, something that you're going to try differently. And as these are coming in, I'm going to take just take a page from your colleagues' books and steal ideas, what ideas are being dropped in the chat, because I'm sure there's some good ones. I'm going to try to give myself another sip of coffee here. Dave, go ahead. I think you can. I think you should be able to come off mute actually and ask me questions if you like. So go ahead. And if you can't, just pop your question in the chat. Yeah, the frequent use of the word failure at this point in the call, it doesn't hurt as much. It's almost like exposure therapy. Yeah, I think that is at the heart of this. So what? To err is to be human. So the goal is to not run and hide from failure, because then they stack up, and then we have big ones. But if we can increase our capacity, small little moments become moments of correction. We're going to talk about that a little bit more here. So wrong is on the road to new knowledge. But first, we have to separate being wrong from being unworthy. So shame or guilt comes when we have connected failure to ourselves, or when we have associated our sense of worthiness with success. The stakes often become too high at this point. We can't be wrong. Perfectionism is a defense strategy. It's a coping mechanism where if we just make everything perfect, it'll be okay. So we need to really disconnect these two and name what's happened as behavior or situation. So this is another strategy that's really helpful when it comes to shifting our relationship with failure. So it's very simple. I failed can shift towards that didn't work, or my assumptions didn't hold up. This subtle shift can be immensely powerful. And I will admit that I have a brutal time doing this. Notice I even did it there. It is brutal to do this. It's a challenge for me to do this. So I continually try to face this. But as a leader, you can do your team a world of good by stating it out loud when you correct yourself. If you've made a mistake, admit it. That didn't work out the way we expected. What were the early warning signs? What did we miss? So see here, you're now turning inquiry into another tool to depersonalize when mistakes happen. Frank, your question is not wanting to be wrong related to the competitiveness of society. I think to some degree it is. Who you surround yourself with is a critical part of this. And on your team, you can actually remake how people show up by showing up differently yourself. And then wrong becomes a completely different thing. Being wrong or having wrong information suddenly isn't a problem. So you can change that experience very dramatically. So the shift away from blame can be referred to as a shift from a blame frame to a contribution frame. When we've been microdosing on enough shifts from judgment to inquiry, we can separating being wrong to being unworthy. And what's interesting is that when we have this shift within ourselves, we can actually engage in the process of and the science of learning, the science of failing well, as Amy would put it, as Dr. Edmondson would put it, I should say, is that all of a sudden we're looking at contributing factors instead of who's wrong. And that unveils a whole host of different kinds of things that we can learn from and do better and do differently. So at a team level, our ability to shift from who's wrong to what's going on fundamentally changes within ourselves and then within the team, and that changes our approaches very drastically. So lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the real significant thing that I want people to take away is shifting your mindset from a prove mindset to an update mindset. People shame themselves more easily when they believe their value comes from being right, proving that their worldview is correct. This is often related to a cognitive bias called confirmation bias. It is a powerful one. It helps us build community, build certainty, which I said before is foolish, but build a more complete worldview. But it's also a trap. You can't learn if you only leave room for more of the same. Your capacity to learn grows when you value updating well. I remember Neil deGrasse Tyson once saying, "I'll never get a tattoo because I can never be so certain about anything." So your goal is no longer to try and see how right you are. It's to see what's the most right based on new information. This is actually a value at Aristotle Performance. It's not about who's right, it's about what's right. It's this cue to remember that blame or a person is very rarely the complete picture. One worldview is very rarely the complete picture. We live in a complex world, so we need to consider what's right, not who's right. And there are many examples of how this shows up in industry and in our lives. Think about smoking. We now know that smoking causes cancers, but doctors used to smoke. They used to distribute cocaine too and promote high sugar cereals, but not anymore. Smoking causes cancer. Cocaine is addictive and problematic at an individual, family, and societal levels. Sugary cereals disrupt the growing brain, impacting learning and attention, and eating a dessert level of sugar for breakfast can certainly contribute to diabetes. We know that now, but do we beat up past selves for not knowing better with a lack of information? In a number of cases, the system and the people in it were more focused on being right and maintaining the illusion of being all-knowing over updating well and applying new thinking. That's why the research comes out, and there's a big delay. People want to have the illusion of being correct. A mindset focused on capturing and applying new knowledge rather than being right is critical. It allows you to see contradiction or cognitive dissonance as data rather than threat, something to be curious about instead. So how do you go about shifting from being right or this prove mindset to an update mindset? When you find contradictions or opposing views, see them as data and engage with your curiosity. Not to prove yourself right, but to find what might be right about the new perspective. What could be possible from this new perspective? And what could you add to your own worldview? In that way, you're building your capacity to be wrong, to take in new information. The greatest challenge is to pick somebody who has an opposite political view and try to find what's right about what they're saying. That would be like macro dosing. For some, I should say. But don't wait for change. Make change a habit. Make staying the same the enemy. For example, at Aristotle Performance, when we are in new product phase, we have a rule. If the idea is at least reasonable, we will try it. And there's very rarely any backing out. Jason had to suffer this recently. He came up with a great idea for us to try out in Manchester. I said, too late. It's on the table now. You got to go do it. And he did. He did a wonderful job. So if the idea is at least reasonable, we try it. And there's very rarely any backing out, no matter how uncomfortable. And the learning is immense. We've learned to share ideas, working together to make it work. And if it fits, it's happening. And this will help you shift and build the muscle of adaptation which removes and reduces threats to the ego. So this is what we need to bring to our team: a fascination with learning, a desire to have our minds blown, not for wealth, status, or because the company says you want more innovation, because you are genuinely, passionately amazed with the world. When we build our capacity to learn, we don't just impact our lives, we become beacons for what it means to be human. Our fascination becomes infectious. Um, a friend of mine recently, uh, a guy named Cam Brown, who I speak of very fondly. We were working at a show in San Francisco. This is well over a decade ago now. And this is an outside venue with 150,000 people in attendance. This is like a big deal. And there was an elaborate stage setup of video screens that would make it look like the DJ was surrounded in all directions by about 60 feet of flames. It was very cool. This isn't a picture of that stage, but it's similar. But at the same time, this was a complex thing to do, managing and to manage, because those set pieces were going to need to come on and off stage in about 5 minutes, which is a big deal. At this time, we're going to have to figure this out. Failure was extremely likely. But what did failure look like? Failure meant six-figure loss for the company. It could mean the show was delayed or didn't work at all, embarrassing everyone, including the performer, damaging reputations, in an industry where reputation, frankly, is kind of everything. I was the lead high rigger, and the lead technician had an idea. We had worked together for years, and he was an up-and-coming leader, and this was his chance to step up. And Cam, my boss, and I conferred, and I just said to him, look, it's not going to work. I said, probably, but he's about to take on a bunch of work, and he ignored you. This was Cam's response. He ignored you, and he said, because I mentioned this to him. I said, it's not going to work, and Casey just ignored me. And there was a really high chance of it not working. We should do something about it. But he's going to have a chance to see if his idea works. And if it fails, he'll learn more than if it works. And I said, you're okay with that? And he laughed. Sure am. Like Cam always did. So I left. I trusted his guidance to let someone possibly fail and learn from it for the betterment of their future. And sure enough, it didn't work. And when it wasn't working, we didn't point fingers. We all jumped in. Talking to the performer's management, we need another minute. Talking to the stage manager, we need another minute. Troubleshooting in small teams, making sure every connection was correct and sharing information rapidly. And it turns out the show actually looked kind of cool, because the fire that was in 60 feet in all directions was blue instead of red and orange. But the company still lost the money. But in the end, it was okay. And when you've built your tolerance for things to go wrong, no shame, just learning, when that is increased, you can actually create the format and the forum for someone else to learn under pressure as well. So you end up providing a gift to others. And I think that's what the greatest gift is that if you can actually create those conditions, you can change someone else's relationship with themselves, someone else's relationship with failure. I love this quote from Brene Brown. Trying to fit in is the opposite of belonging, and you can't belong anywhere until you belong to yourself. But if you can increase the opportunity to increase your capacity to learn, if you can increase your capacity, you can turn failure into fuel instead of just another fire. And you can do it for other people too. For those of you who haven't, you are welcome to go to www.aristotleperformance.com/free book. Just popped it into the chat. If you fill out the form there, we'll send you a copy of my book when it releases on February 10th. It's part of your ticket with Psych Safety Day. And I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with everyone and have a conversation. And that's the end of my talk. right on the 1 minute mark. So thank you very much, everyone.